Hello, and welcome to Mission in 5, the podcast, the show where we ask 5 simple questions to ministry practitioners to learn more about who they are and where they see God moving in their local communities. My name is Greg Mamula. I'm the Associate Executive Minister and Region Missionary for the American Baptist Churches of Nebraska. And every single week, I get to partner with churches and ministry practitioners. And I'm always amazed at the many and varied ways that God works in our individual communities and when multiple churches come together for mission and ministry. And so, that's the purpose of this podcast, to share with you the many things that God is doing and to meet some of the people participating in God's mission in Nebraska, across the country, and around the world. Well, my guest today is the pastor of the Second Baptist Church in Lincoln, Nebraska, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Wisthoff. Pastor Steve has been with Second Baptist Lincoln since 2009. He's a native of North Dakota, and he and his wife Grace have 3 daughters and a growing number of grandchildren. Steve is active in his community. He enjoys sports. He enjoys the outdoors. He does genealogy. He plays music. He loves to travel. He's an avid motorcyclist. Steve took the rare opportunity to engage in a ministry sabbatical this last summer. And during our conversation, we talked about what he did on a sabbatical, the importance of taking one, some of the theological and biblical roots of why pastors and churches should approach sabbaticals and take breaks, how the church stepped up and kind of regained some ownership of ministry that they had maybe handed over to the pastor and things the pastor handed back to the church that maybe the pastor was doing too much ministry. And so it was kind of a cool conversation around sabbatical. We also talked about a couple of really cool ministries that they're doing in their community of reaching out to people who are doing drug rehabs or Yazidi people. You'll learn more about who they are in this conversation. So here's my conversation with the Reverend Dr. Steve Wisthoff. Well, Pastor Steve Wisthoff from Second Baptist Church in Lincoln, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, as you know, our format is easy enough. We're going to ask you 5 questions about being a ministry practitioner and to learn more about who you are and how you see God moving in the community of Lincoln. So let's jump right in. Who are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in North Dakota, and most of my ministry was in North Dakota as a pastor. I served 2 congregations in North Dakota over a period of about 20 years. And I was feeling like it might be time to make a change. I was just feeling that I was kind of getting a restlessness and so on, that holy restlessness, I think that God was perhaps leading me elsewhere. And Susan Gillies told me that if you ever are thinking about moving, give me a call. And so I called Susan and said, well, I'm kind of thinking that way.
Right.
And she had Second Baptist open at that time. And so that kind of led me to Nebraska. And I feel like it's been a wonderful move. It's just been I can really see God's hand in providing me this opportunity to come and minister here in Lincoln.
So for those who may not know, Susan Gillies was the executive minister of ABC Nebraska at the time when you were transitioning between ministry roles, right?
Right. And I've known Susan because she was at the University of North Dakota back when I was first in ministry. So I've known her since the early 80s.
Wow.
And yeah, she's been, of course, a Nebraska native and executive minister here prior to Robin, but I've known her for several decades.
Yeah, and most recently, before retiring a second time, was interim general secretary for ABC
That's
USA.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about you. What are you into? Do you like sports? I know you're into motorcycles. What else?
Well, I do a little bit of I do enjoy my motorcycle. It's partly transportation and partly sport.
Okay.
But I do enjoy it, and I also enjoy some artistic kind of things, some painting and some scrapbooking and things like that as an output of creativity. And those are, and of course I enjoy Husker football too. I think that living in Lincoln, that's almost a necessity, but
yeah, I think so.
I certainly enjoy it too.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Now, I know you're into music as well. Like you play guitar and you like to sing.
Yeah, I don't do as much guitar playing anymore. It kind of sits idle and collects dust. But I have always played guitar ever since I was probably elementary school. I started playing guitar,
Right.
and through youth ministry and through pastoral ministry, I've always picked up the guitar and used that as outlet of ministry, and I've really enjoyed it. And I sing and so on. But I think as I've gotten older, and I've also moved into a congregation that has a ministry of music, I'm doing far less of that and much more ministry of teaching and counseling and preaching and so on.
Okay, well then let's ask our second question then. So how did you get here? Let's talk about that call to ministry in North Dakota and all the. I mean, you've been involved in so many things. Ministers Council. You've been on some national things. You've been on the leadership board here in the region and pastoring all these years. Kind of walk us through some of that.
Okay. Well, my initial call to ministry was an unexpected and probably an unwelcome call because my dad is a pastor, and I thought I was very proud of him, and he is great. I didn't have anything against ministry. I loved ministry. I loved the church, but my attitude was it's not for me. And God had another plan and all of that. My dad got sick, and during the time that he was sick, my dad asked me if I would fill the pulpit for him. And I thought, well, how do you tell a sick person no? And so I began, this is back when I was in college, I began filling the pulpit for him for several months until he did pass away. And then I began doing supply preaching for a couple of small congregations in the area after that. And that sort of led to my calling to ministry. And it's actually Don Shoemaker. I give him credit. Gina Selecta's father, who really inspired me to go on to seminary and to pursue ministry.
Okay, and then you pastored some churches in the Dakotas, and
yes, I pastored all of my. I was a youth pastor for 2 years in Detroit, Michigan. And then I went from there to Lisbon, North Dakota, and I was there for 7.5 years. And then I went from there to Bismarck, where I spent 13 years at First Baptist of Bismarck. And then from there I came down to Lincoln.
And somewhere in there you got a doctorate from Sioux Falls Seminary, right?
I did, yes. The generosity of the people at First Baptist of Bismarck allowing me the time and also helping me financially, I was able to pursue a doctor of ministry degree from what is now Sioux Falls Seminary. At that time, it was North American Baptist Seminary. Okay. Has since changed its name, and that I finished that back in about 2005. So that was a good and healthy thing for me to. I kind of felt the need at that time. My reason for doing it was largely to sort of, I wouldn't say I was bored at that time, but I felt challenged at that time to learn some more things and to expand my understanding of ministry.
Yeah. So I think that's a perfect transition then, because sometimes pastors need a new challenge. They need a new thought. Sometimes those are given to us because something in the church shifts suddenly, and so you're faced with new challenges. And then sometimes things are really good and healthy and stable in a church, and you have to find that stimulus outside. And so sometimes you get the opportunity to go to school or whatever, but you also can take sabbaticals.
Yes.
And you just took one this summer, right?
I did, yes. That was a new experience, very new, because I've been 32 years of ministry, and I've never been out of the pulpit more than about 3 Sundays in a row. I think probably 2 Sundays, or I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 Sundays in a row. When I came to Lincoln, I inquired with the congregation. I said, "Would you consider sometime down the road, when I fulfilled a certain number of years, providing a sabbatical, or at least allowing me to do a sabbatical?" I didn't ask for funding or anything like that, but just to allow allow me to do a sabbatical?
Okay.
And they said yes, we would consider that. So at 7 years, I didn't feel ready, and I don't think the congregation was ready. But I just finished my 10th year,
Wow.
and by that time, the congregation, or I was, I proposed it to the congregation, and I have to, say that there were several people in the congregation that were backing me on this, supporting it, and because this is something that Second Baptist of Lincoln has never done before. They've never offered their pastor a sabbatical period, or
Okay.
so this was brand new for them. It was brand new for me. I didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what to expect, and it turned out to really, really work out well. I think they were very satisfied with how it went, and it was really fun to see. I had a parishioner pass away while I was on sabbatical. And one of our laymen actually stepped in and conducted the service.
Wow.
So we've got some leadership ability in our congregation that I'm just very, very proud of. And they step up and they do it. And so I didn't have a lot to worry about when I was gone. And so I did do the sabbatical. The congregation was supportive of it. And just to give you a little idea of what I did.
Yeah.
I spent my wife and I, my wife Grace and I, we spent 2 weeks in Central Europe, touring from on our own. We weren't part of any tours, so we basically flew into Budapest, rented a car, and took off. And spent 2 days in Budapest, and 2 days in Vienna, and 2 days in Krakow, and about 4 days in northern Poland, and a day in Berlin, and a couple days in Prague, and then back to Budapest.
Wow.
And so we spent about 2 weeks, about 15 days, just traveling and enjoying it. And we had two different aspects or parts of the sabbatical. Okay. One was the Holocaust. Everywhere we went in Central Europe, there were signs of the evils of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Residual landmarks and plaques, and just all kinds of museums and everything else. So we did that. And the other purpose was that both my wife and I, our ancestors have come from northern Poland, just a few miles apart.
Oh, okay. And
so we wanted to walk where our ancestors walked. And we didn't have anything to go on as far as finding any relatives or tombstones or anything like that. But it was basically just to be where they came from and to feel that sense of our historical roots. So we did that. And then when we came back, my wife had to go back to work. And then I took off for the next several weeks down to the southeastern United States. I went to Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina. And I spent time with my grandkids. I spent time at a Bible camp down there, and reflection and prayer and study and writing and all kinds of, a little bit more academic kinds of things, but also rest. I did a lot of resting there as well.
Yeah.
I spent some time with my in-laws, doing some work for them. I did go to the American Baptist Historical Society archives in Atlanta, and enjoyed handling handwritten documents by Isaac Bacchus and a few others, and it was so just cool. Pretty neat. Yeah, it was pretty neat. Yeah. So then I came home. I came home right around the 20th of August. So I was gone. I was on sabbatical for 3 months.
If you were to define a purpose for sabbatical for somebody who's in a church and maybe has never had that opportunity to go on one, how would you say this is why you need a sabbatical?
There's the theological roots for sabbatical are found in Leviticus and other parts of the Old Testament, where the land was allowed to lie fallow for 7 years for the sake of rejuvenation, or not for 7 years, on the seventh year, for the sake of rejuvenation. And so the same thing is true of our own spiritual growth. And if we could compare our own lives to a plant, which Scripture does on a regular basis, then we would say that we too need the fertilizing and the care and everything else that it takes to remain alive and vital for the future of our ministry. There's nothing worse than seeing somebody burn out in ministry, and I witnessed it firsthand. My father burned out completely in ministry, and he was just about ready to go back to ministry after about a 3-year leave, and that's when he got sick, and he never did go back to ministry. But so I've seen it happen firsthand. I didn't want to be the product of that. I would much rather be proactive and do what it takes to care for myself and being productive in ministry.
So from the church's perspective, how is sabbatical good for a church? You cited one kind of example that two specifically I heard you say before, is one that the people thought it was good. And then two, you said that there was an opportunity for some of them to step up and do some leadership that they may not have done had you been present.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Is I think they proved to themselves that that there is a strong and vital leadership within the congregation. It's really easy, and I'm especially, I think, susceptible. I think one of my weaknesses is I do too much quite often with taking this and that and just kind of going and doing it. In other words, taking over,
right?
And some of the tasks that really could be done by laity. And I think stepping away like this was a way for them to exercise that. And it's really been neat, because I've come back, and some of the things that I was doing before and felt obligated to do, they're being done now, and I'm not stepping back into them quickly. And I don't even need to, and they don't even want me to necessarily. I mean, we have a ministry that I'll probably talk about later, with the Bridge and a treatment center here in town. And we've got, I was co-teaching it with one of our laymen. And when I went on sabbatical, somebody else stepped in. When I got back, I said, I went to the one who stepped in for me during the summer, and I said to him, well, what do you think? Do I need to step back in? He said, no, we got it covered. So he was having such a good time with it, and he otherwise wouldn't be doing that if I hadn't stepped away from it. So I think it's a good lesson for us as pastors, is that we oftentimes deprive people of the opportunities of ministry by doing too much.
Depriving people of the opportunity of ministry.
Yeah.
I like that idea. When we get to do a lot of ordinations and installations and those sort of things, and when I think about those, I always come back to Ephesians 4, and that call of a pastor is to equip the saints for their works of ministry.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we do just what you just said. We do it all for them. We're not equipping them. Or we spend a lot of time equipping them and never release them to do that work. And so I think it's cool that you went away, they took on that mantle of ministry, and then when you came back, they're like, you can't have it back. This is important to us.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
So good. So sabbaticals are sometimes described as being kind of in a 3-phase, because you had a 3-month sabbatical, 12 weeks.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've heard them described as, you kind of spend the first third decompressing, disconnecting from the ministry, and so that you can find yourself again.
Yes.
And then the middle part, you do some sort of continuing ed or seeing of things or whatever. And then the last part is you kind of spiritually renewed and renewing yourself and thinking about what it's going to be like to come back. Did you find that to be a true pattern for yourself? You seem to have mixed them in along the way. I don't know that it was intentionally divided into thirds like that, but it sounds like you get a lot of those things.
Yeah, I was able to step away rather quickly, because I've been anticipating this for quite a long time, this sabbatical, and for probably a year. And I've been making plans for it. I've been, spending a lot of extra time preparing for it. That's the thing about what needs to be understood about sabbatical, is you just don't walk away.
Right.
There's a lot of preparation that you have to do before you go. And so by the time I actually went on sabbatical, my first act of going on sabbatical was jumping in the car and driving out to Gary Cole's my friend Gary Cole's retirement out at Scotts Bluff. He's been pastor out there for about 9 years, and so that was and I when I was driving out there, I felt this incredible sense of I'm not even connected anymore. And I really felt that almost from that point. But what really helped, and this was suggested in the sabbatical recommendations by some of the experts, is front load the sabbatical experience with a multicultural kind of a trip, like exotic trip. And that's what we did as we went to Europe, because that really pulls you away where you are completely out of touch from your congregation.
Part of your sabbatical included people filling the pulpit. That was I got to preach there a few times and enjoyed that experience.
I really appreciate you, both you and Robin, stepping in and doing that. And I think that's one of the great gifts that you give to us as pastors, is that you told us early on, if you go on sabbatical, we'll step in and we'll each take, a certain amount of that. It was a wonderful thing that you guys stepped in and you shared that with us. And then we had we've got several laymen in the church who are very, very lay persons, I should say, in our congregation, are very capable, and they stepped in. They did a Sunday. So it took me no time at all to fill up the roster of pulpit supply for the entire 3 months. So it's great. Very doable. Very, we've got some wonderful talent in our region.
Very good. Well, let's talk specifically about Second Baptist Church in Lincoln. You are still the pastor. You are now back. You are engaging in ministry. Yep. The people are clearly more engaged in ministry than maybe they were 4 or 5 months ago. So what's going on? What are some of the things happening at Second Baptist Church in Lincoln?
Well, I came back on the first Sunday of September, and when I walked through the door, there was paper, I should say posters hanging everywhere that people had put together that said "Welcome home."
Oh, that's fun.
And that was really neat to walk in, and it was also the first Sunday of our former accompanist coming back as full time, and so she was also welcome back the same Sunday. So they kind of made that a celebration day, and that was really meaningful to me. I felt very loved.
That's good.
And so what's happening at Second Baptist? Well, I'm back in the saddle now. And as I said earlier, we have one of our I guess it started back several years ago, probably about 7 years ago, I think. The time flies by, where we did the with Glennis LaBar, the missional church learning experience, and that was terrific for us, and that got us involved with an organization in town that is a treatment center, and they had a need, and their need was they needed transportation for their clients, their alcohol and drug dependent individuals who are in for treatment. They needed transportation for them to go to their medical appointments, because in order to complete their treatment, it was required that they have a certain number of medical appointments to keep to monitor their body's health and everything while they're in treatment. And so we engaged with them, or we contacted them, or they contacted us, I guess, and we began that almost immediately. So that was about 6 or 7 years ago, and we've been driving them to their appointments ever since.
Wow.
Either 1 or 2 days a week, depending upon what their scheduling is.
So you just have volunteers from the church take up time slots and volunteer to take people to follow up medical appointments?
Exactly. Yeah, they would just take. It would usually be 3 or 4 guys that they would haul. Would take to the medical facility for their appointments. It's a clinic run by Lutheran Family Services, And so we began doing that, and over the course of the years, we've gained their trust. And about a year ago, I approached the new director down there, and said, "Would you be interested in us conducting a Bible study?" And so we started doing a Bible study, and about a year ago,
Mm-hmm.
every Monday night, and that's it's voluntary, because it's just so it's sometimes we'd show up and nobody would be there,
Right.
because of their own scheduling. Sometimes it's a little quirky,
Mm-hmm.
and other times lately we've had 7 guys who have been part of the study. And so that's the one that has been taken over. I'm not going down there anymore on Monday nights, because we have a couple of people. But that opened up an opportunity. One of the guys who graduated from the program ended up going to a place called Houses of Hope,
Uh-huh.
and that's like a halfway house here in town.
Okay.
And when you go from the bridge, which is a treatment center, to the back out into society after your treatment, you'll oftentimes spend several weeks at Houses of Hope. One of the guys who had gone through our Bible study down at the bridge said, "Hey, why don't we have a Bible study at Houses of Hope?"
Oh.
And I said, "Well, because nobody's asked." And so I went to the director a few weeks ago and said, "Would you be interested in allowing us to come in and doing Bible study?" And so he found a night for us. So every Sunday night now, starting this coming Sunday night, it'll be my first time, I will be going down and leading a Bible study. I'll be bringing one of our laypersons with me to help me with it. So it's kind of a good thing that I got kicked out of that other spot, because now God has opened this other opportunity for us to serve, and maybe I'll get kicked out of this one too. But it's kind of neat, because the missional church learning experience really got us focused outside the church. Of course, that's its purpose, is to get ministry going as an outward flow from the church congregation.
Yeah.
And that's really been happening. It's been really exciting. We do a barbecue once a year for the guys down at the bridge, the treatment center. And lately, we've been inviting them to our men's breakfast every month. And so there's been 20 guys from the bridge coming over to have breakfast with us, and they hear the word, they hear a devotional, and so God has just really opened some doors for us to minister to this group of men.
Wow, that's great. Man, that's pretty impressive. I mean, it's one of those things that you start to think about, if these are sort of like people who are part of your church now. They may not be there on Sunday mornings, but you are going and being present with them, and they are part of the life of the church. And because of the volunteers that are engaging with it, it has multiple impact. And it's so important that those who are participating in the ministry, we kind of tend to be a little parental with our ministries, but the fact that somebody who was a recipient of the ministry carried it into a new place, I think is significant for just where your heart is and how it's working.
Yeah, and what's neat is it was initiated by one of the clients, not by us.
Yeah.
It's and I think we shouldn't even be surprised about that. I think we should realize that God is going to do stuff that's far beyond our expectation and comprehension, and God's going to use people who we least expect to do it.
Yeah, very good. Well, what else is going on at Second that we might need to know about?
Well, we're generally speaking just moving along hopefully in the right direction. We don't have, we've got a lot of our normal activities going on.
Sure.
We try to focus on outreach. We have been involved. This is kind of a neat thing too. I see it as a win. A lot of times we see if a ministry folds up, we see it as a defeat. But we had been working with the Yazidi people for several years, and it just seemed like that time was coming to an end. It seemed like the Yazidi people were no longer living in our neighborhood. They were moving out into other neighborhoods, and particularly up in the neighborhood where Belmont Baptist is.
Okay.
And so I talked to Pastor Mike up at Belmont Baptist, and proposed this to him, and he said, "Yeah, we would like to do that." Or he talked to some of his people, and they came to the decision that they would like to open up their own building to do. And what they are is they're English classes for Yazidi women.
Mm-hmm.
Yazidi people are from the Middle East, on what is called the Nineveh Plains, the northern part of Iraq,
Right.
and they were forced out by ISIS. They had a major a genocide back in 5 years ago last month, and where thousands of people were killed by ISIS. And so many of them came to Lincoln, and Lincoln now has the largest population of Yazidi people in the United States.
Wow.
And so because of that, and the ministry that some missionaries are involved in, we've connected with them, and we were a host site for one of two, maybe it's three English classes for Yazidi women.
Mm-hmm.
The men are out in the workforce. The men know English because most of them have been to school, and they were also translators for the United States military.
Oh, right.
That's one of the unique things about the Yazidis is that's how they were able to immigrate over to the U.S. is because of their connection with the U.S. military. The women, on the other hand, are much more isolated, and so they don't learn English as fast. And so this gets them into a class setting with other Yazidi women, where they can begin to learn English, basic English.
Wow.
So now that's been passed along to Belmont Baptist, and I just think it's so cool that we can partner like that, and be able to say, this is no longer the time for us to do this, but maybe it's the time for you to do it. And what's cool is that the ladies literally have to walk up the hill about 50 yards up the hill, and they're right at Belmont.
Wow.
From the apartment buildings and houses where they live.
And that's several miles from you at this point.
Yeah, several miles from us. It's all the way across town for us.
Right. So I think that's a really neat observation, and I like the way that you frame that thought of we tend to see when ministries reach a cycle of closure as a loss, as a defeat, as somehow a failure. But you did what you did. It was contextual. They were in your neighborhood. They're no longer in your neighborhood. You saw a way to help pass that ministry to another, and it's going to continue to carry on. And I just think that's a great perspective to have. So many of our ministries, I think we hang on to for far too long, and it zaps energy and resources and people and time, so that we can't do what's next.
And we see it as a failure if we don't do it.
Yeah.
If we stop doing it, if it transitions in some way, we say, "Oh, that really failed." Or, "Oh, no, not necessarily. It wasn't." It was all in God's timing.
Right. Very good. Well, I appreciate all this that you've shared with me. How can we as American Baptists partner with you, pray with you? What are some of the things that we can do?
Well, pray for our sister churches here. Of course, in Lincoln is First Baptist has called a new pastor, and we want to see these relationships between our congregations be strong, and not competitive in any way, but rather to be to have a sense of unity and purpose. And I think that's something that you could pray for all of us. And certainly, I think as far as Second Baptist goes, is just pray for growth and continued growth, and that God will achieve what God wants to achieve through us.
Very good. Well, it's been great talking with Pastor Steve Wisthoff of Second Baptist Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. If somebody wanted to know more about maybe the thoughts behind a sabbatical or doing these types of MCLE ministries, what would be a way to learn more about Second Baptist or to get a hold of you?
Yeah, you could email me just at stevewisthoff@gmail.com. I'd be more than happy to respond. And I would encourage church leaders, if this is something that you haven't, your pastor hasn't done this before, your pastor, he or she may not come to you and say, "Hey, I'd like to do a sabbatical." You may need to go to them and say, "Have you ever considered this?" You may want to encourage them to do that, because they're probably not going to ask for it. It's too shy. So please, if you want more ideas on what, I'd be more than happy to talk to you.
or you can reach me at 402-430-8308.
Very good. Well, thank you for your time today, Pastor Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
Well, thank you for listening to Mission in 5, the podcast. Keep tuning in as we introduce you to the ministry practitioners engaging with God's mission through the churches of Nebraska and the larger American Baptist community. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and contact information to Reverend Dr. Steve Wisthoff and Second Baptist Church in Lincoln. There's also a few links there about the importance of Sabbatical. There's also contact information there if you want to get a hold of me or the American Baptist Churches of Nebraska. Subscribe to the podcast at Podbean, iTunes, or Google Play. While there, be sure to rate and review us so that we know how you're enjoying the podcast and so other people can find the podcast a little more easily. Send us ideas on who you'd like us to interview for future episodes, and feel free to support us by giving through the PayPal link on our abcnebraska.com website. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.